Okay, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our workshop. My name is Missy Watson, and the title of our workshop is Applying an Analytical Tool to Develop Anti-Racist and Decolonial Pedagogies. We'll spend about 25 or 30 minutes reviewing very key concepts informing anti-racist and decolonial pedagogies, and then we'll invite all of you to spend some time brainstorming and discussing some new strategies that you may want to implement in your own classes and own teaching. So I'm associate professor at City College, and all of our presenters today are hailing from City College as well. And each of us have studied language, TESOL, and pedagogy, and some of us teach college writing, others ESL, others teach college prep, and others are college administrators or tutors at writing centers and beyond. And many of us are also authors of books and edited collections, research articles, news articles, open educational resources, and the such. And we came together this semester in a graduate seminar that I'm teaching titled Composition Pedagogies. And our goal was to use an anti-racist and decolonial framework at the start as a lens to analyze and extend the pedagogies that we explored together and added to our repertoire. And so we've been sort of weaving together different pedagogical perspectives, and we decided to bring in others to this conversation, to this exploration. So we're here to share, but we're also here to keep learning and to invite you into that process. So thank you for being here, and we hope that you enjoy and benefit from our workshop.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in on our workshop. My name's Gloria Nguyen. Why do we even need an anti-racist and decolonial approach to teaching? In my part of this presentation, I'll demonstrate this need by describing two studies that exemplify the often invisible impacts of racism and colonization. Writing researcher Bethany Davila conducted a survey she called Disguised Composition, which aimed to examine language attitudes towards students of different races. The participants in Davila's study were instructors from nearly 175 public research institutions and were instructors of composition, rhetoric, literature, and creative writing. In short, Davila gave these different college composition instructors from around the country the same essay written by a white middle-class female student from a Midwestern university. But each instructor was told that the paper was written by students from different racial and gender backgrounds. So while each instructor was given the same paper, some were told that the paper was written by an Asian male, others a white female, others a Black male, and so on. There were 12 different race and gender combinations total. Then the instructors were asked to give written feedback, assign a grade, and answer questions about their responses to language in the paper and about the student author. Some of those questions were, what was striking to you in this paper and why? And in as much detail as possible, describe the student you pictured as having written this paper. Participants were also asked to rank how well they understood the student's main argument on a scale of 0 to 100. Davila's findings show us how much even well-intentioned teachers' subconscious bias affects our grading. Instructors who assumed they were reading an essay written by an African-American student pointed to the use of African-American English and gave a lower average grade, a D+, and a lower comprehension score than instructors who evaluated papers they felt were written by ESL students. This confirms the idea that African-American English is arguably the most visibly and consistently stigmatized language variety in the country. Instructors who assumed they were reading an essay written by non-native English speakers, interestingly, pointed to examples of students showing ESL linguistic markers, yet were evaluated with more grace, perhaps because instructors assumed that the student was an ESL student and thus still developing their English. Davila noted in teachers' responses the pattern of perceiving accents among Latino students and Asian female students, which she believes likely relates to the perpetual foreigner stereotype. Davila concluded that Latino and Asian female students might be read as linguistic others, but this othering does not negatively affect their grades and in fact might lead to a higher understanding score. The pattern of imagining racialized student identities as also being L2 writers or as multilingual in contrast with imagining white student identities as monolingual is evidence of ratiolinguistic ideologies and maps onto documented microaggressions related to language and accent. When instructors face students of color, they might expect, look for, and even construct non-standardness or otherness in their writing. On the flip side, it's not just educators who racialize non-standard language, but also students. In a study done in 1992 by Donald Rubin, researchers found that race and accents create certain expectations that students had about their instructors. In this study, the participants were 62 undergraduate native English speakers. They were given one of two recordings to listen to. One was a lesson on a science topic and the other on a humanities topic. Half of the time, the participants would be shown a projected image of a white female instructor, and the other half of the time, they were shown a projected image of an Asian female instructor. However, both of the possible recordings were made by the same speaker. Even though the lectures heard in this study were recorded by a white monolingual speaker, students still claimed to hear an accent in cases when shown the image of the Asian female instructor. Not only did these participants imagine an accent, they were also found, through an assessment, to have less of an understanding of the recordings when shown the image of the Asian female instructor. This is worth emphasizing. Not only do students hear accents when they were not there with the influence of an image of an Asian woman, but their racialization of the instructor apparently led them to comprehend information less effectively. According to Rubin, native speakers of English are usually given the benefit of the doubt. Some turn out to be good teachers and others do not. However, non-native speakers of English, specifically speakers of Asian, African, or South American languages, are often not given a chance at all. There are so many negative consequences of these two studies, and many other stories like these in classrooms across the United States. We'll discuss more later how our classrooms are racist and colonizing, but for now, here's a brief sampling of how people are affected by these oppressive systems. There are unconscious biases of non-white students and teachers. There's a lack of a sense of community in the classroom. Bilingual and multilingual students are losing their home communities and native languages. There's a push and pull of identity and community among multicultural students. Students or instructors are being treated poorly due to their perceived accentedness or lack of English fluency. And students are falling behind because they're not getting the attention or lessons needed, causing low-income families to feel like they have to pay for outside resources for their children to improve in school. Students and teachers alike need to be educated on matters of language, race, and colonization in the classroom. In doing so, we can all be taught to take some responsibility for a successful educational experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria, for demonstrating our need for anti-racist and decolonial pedagogy. My name is Sunny. Thank you so much for attending, everybody in the audience. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about anti-racist pedagogy. So to begin, let's take a look at where did anti-racist pedagogy come from. So anti-racist pedagogy is informed by critical race theory, CRT, a field pioneered by legal scholars like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. Now, I'm sure you've heard of this before on the news or online, but to be clear about what we're talking about, its main tenets are that race and racism are enmeshed with the normal operations of society, that racism persists because of those who benefit from it, and that race becomes a social construct through the process of racialization. Now, anti-racist pedagogy emerged as a response to our educational systems with these tenets in mind, pioneered by scholars like Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate. It aims to change our educational establishments from being exclusionary and assimilationist to inclusive and accessible sites that teach and nurture critical thinking, especially on the institutional level. We can achieve this by teaching with an anti-racist approach. So what does that look like? Number one, you should take a stance against institutional racism. Make your classroom a known anti-racist space. Show your students that racism, especially institutional racism, is not tolerated in your classroom and that you will work to resist it in any way you can. One good way to demonstrate this is by inviting and honoring your students' lived experiences, especially those regarding education. We can also apply a critical and anti-racist magnifying glass to the mainstream. In order to fully embody the promise we make to our students to stand against racism, we must carefully analyze together the racialized defaults in our institutions. Mainly ask yourself, what role does race have in these defaults and assumptions? And why do we do this? Well, our educational systems are still largely perpetuate white, Eurocentric forms of thought and knowledge as the default, thus invalidating non-white, non-Western knowledge and experiences. Our students should not believe that academic success is contingent on their ability to assimilate into dominant culture. If they do, marginalized students will believe that they are deficient in some way, when the reality is that academia at large was not set up for their success in mind. As a result, we should encourage reflection and introspection as much as possible for students and faculty. My colleague Erkanaz will discuss this more in depth at a later point, but it's similar to the previous point where we take a magnifying glass, but to ourselves, to acknowledge all aspects of our identities, those which are privileged and those which are not. This sounds like a lot to remember, but implementing anti-racist pedagogy is a process, not something that can be done overnight or done at all. You will make mistakes just as your students make mistakes in your classes, but by practicing anti-racism, we as educators invite our students to not only think critically about the world and society around them, but to think radically even. So how can we as teachers promote radical responses to racism? We can make space for race in our classrooms. We tend to shy away from conversations involving race in the classroom because it can feel uncomfortable or taboo to discuss, but doing so allows oppressive systems to remain unchecked. Don't shy away from discussions of race in the classroom. Talking about race can be difficult, but it is not something that should be avoided. Avoiding conversations about race just reinforces the silence that racism thrives upon. Welcome these opportunities to be real with your students about institutional racism. It's also important to note that these discussions should not be limited to the history classroom. Anywhere where knowledge is taught, there should be discussions about what constitutes knowledge, who decides what gets to be knowledge, and acknowledging alternative modes of making or recounting knowledge. It's also important that we model resistance and resilience for our students. We can demonstrate this by asking questions, thinking critically, and criticizing the racism present in our institutions, so students know it's okay to do as well. But if we'd like to encourage our students to actually take action with their education or with their lives at large, we can also take measures to validate our students as sources of knowledge and meaning making. Now, this doesn't mean that we should make sharing personal information a requirement in our classes, but we can advocate for every student so each has an equal opportunity to tell their stories. And we can also champion our lived experiences and our students' lived experiences in the same way that we champion academic sources of knowledge. On that same note, we should also work to break the US white academic canon and uplift international scholars of color as much as possible. We already know how much representation matters. As such, integrating scholarship throughout the curriculum from sources from non-white, non-Western authors is necessary. Such scholarship should not be treated as additional or optional, and it should not be presented as a diversity week unit. By doing all of this, we can create communities out of our classrooms. By encouraging openness, mutual respect, and curiosity, we establish trust between educators and students and within students themselves. This fosters collaborative learning, which allows everyone's voices to be heard and valued. As such, we reject competitive learning styles that pit students against each other for grades or teacher approval. We instead invite our students to view learning as lifelong, that can happen anywhere and everywhere, especially outside of the classroom. And we also establish that we as instructors are also still constantly learning, making mistakes, and improving. Our students know that they learn from us, but they should also recognize that we learn from them and that it's a collaborative effort. And this is the very goal of our workshop, to continue learning and growing as instructors together, taking into account the racist institutions in which we work and empowering our students to break down the societal structures that oppress them. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcelise Elizabeth Campo. I'm an English writing tutor and college assistant at John Jay College and a graduate student at City College of New York. And I'll be undertaking the task of informing you about decolonial pedagogy. Thank you and welcome. So, what problems does a decolonial pedagogy seek to address? For far too long, colonial and Western ways of thinking and living have dominated in the US and far beyond. These systemically supported and prized ways of being have also led to the domination of peoples and the erasure of their language, culture, humanity, dignity, and authority within aspects of society like education and knowledge making. A majority of teaching practices in the West has been influenced by old traditions and ideals held in high esteem since the first colonizer deemed to exploit, and enslave the New World and other resource-rich countries. Currently, students of all backgrounds dwell and study within systems that follow the rules and regulations steeped in the ideologies of colonialism and Western thought. Students must thus enter an intellectual world that thrives on crafting and upholding Western ideals, artificial borders, and colonizing rules that do not help the masses, but create an educational system that benefits the few and not the many. The debilitating maiming that truly affects students lies in their positions on the outskirts of academia and on the wrong side of the border of higher education, which unfortunately caters to a specific kind of speech and knowledge. As Walter Manolio puts it, if knowledge is colonized, one of the tasks ahead is to decolonize knowledge. Currently, then, there exists a need to reimagine how we educate our future progeny and how we make and understand knowledge. However, this re-education must go further than merely teaching students to tolerate each other. It must begin by salving the wounds of past colonial transgressions. So, what is decolonial pedagogy? According to Carlos Tejada and Manuel Espinoza and Chris Gutierrez, a decolonizing pedagogy addresses both the means and the ends of schooling. In other words, decolonizing pedagogy requires that students no longer feel oppressed or maligned in our school systems. Hopefully, with this approach, the ends will justify the means in a new system that champions social and educational growth. Decolonial pedagogy seeks to foster a more inclusive yet identity-expressing classroom environment that welcomes all voices within our curriculums and teaching practices, taking extra care to ensure that voices often ignored and silenced are brought forth. Our jobs as educators involves raising with a Z the borders found in society and educational systems, and raising the spirits and intellects of our students by making sure our teachings bring about a delinking of chains that fortify colonized ideologies. I would like to draw your attention to two quotes by different scholars who best define this term delinking. This break from coloniality and colonization, aptly termed delinking, refers to a process of unlearning the associated dispositions, orientations, values, and actions instilled by the colonial regime. Kasturi Barhari Leek. To delink from colonial thinking, scholars push for an acknowledgement that knowledge is always already plural and diverse. Salafa Zindani. Ultimately, delinking means to disconnect from colonized thinking, which enslaves the modern thought that all cultures and people have validated ideas, which offer avenues to keep pieces of knowledge that all can use to perceive and interact in our modern world. Decolonial pedagogy calls on instructors to construct new classroom environments that students will use in their daily lives without ostracizing their home communities or abandoning their home languages. Decolonial pedagogy brings to light the injustices veiled in ideals that privilege the white Eurocentric views of Western culture, inviting students to name the injustices that they experience in their daily lives, or vicariously through unfair practices unleashed on those that look or speak like them or not, creates opportunities for equity and social justice. From this sharing of honest and diverse anecdotes, whether in written or verbal form, truer expression can be nurtured. That expression gets strengthened once books, articles, media of non-white Eurocentric authors, storytellers, activists get added to our course syllabi. Why? Because giving a voice to those on the margins makes them heard and acknowledges their struggles as a global disease unleashed by centuries of oppression due to the colonization of people and countries. The main goal of a decolonial pedagogy lies in offering our students the full picture of how and why we teach certain histories, ideologies, and champion a knowledge favoring archaic, Eurocentric Western views. Decolonial pedagogy involves asking hard questions and crafting assignments and facilitating or moderating discussions and debates in our classrooms that oppose those views. The greatest importance lies in allowing our students, all of our students of differing backgrounds, cultures, and creeds to feel that they matter and that their individual life stories can be leveraged as teaching moments in the classroom. Still, the decolonial pedagogy stance veers away from just replacing old ways of learning and acquiring knowledge with just one all-encompassing ideology that can speak for all minority groups and others that exist at the margins of current society. The key lies in constantly shifting perspectives by examining the validity of all types of intelligences, noting and encouraging that all people think thoroughly, analyze deeply, and synthesize concretely surrounding stimuli allows for true social justice. When education no longer champions belittling, ostracizing, and reducing people by elevating a select few, we will have gotten closer to our decolonial ideals. Thank you.
Thank you, Mars. Hello, my name is Erkanaz Shaminov. My colleagues talked about the what and the why. So what does it mean to be anti-racist and decolonial, and why does it matter? So now I'll talk about the how to create such a classroom. We separated this how into these 4 categories. And this handout, which we'll share, offers an abbreviated overview. You can save it to your computer and use it as a reference tool while you're prepping your classes. We will also provide an expander version with more detail and a list of practical classroom activities and assignments. The first category is mainly about self-work and interpersonal dynamics. For example, educating ourselves on relevant topics and becoming more aware of our assumptions and why we subscribe to certain teaching values or practices. Once in the classroom, taking a participatory approach is about student-teacher collaborations and supporting the potential of all students to succeed no matter their differences, also including students in the learning process. This challenges the teacher as authority model. So this is about treating students collegially, inviting their perspectives and stories into the classroom, acknowledging that they have valuable things to say, and also incorporating their feedback into the course. So when creating the syllabus, it could be useful to adopt universal design. So thinking about colors, formatting, font and font size, tone and language, so the syllabus can read inclusive and inviting rather than too authoritative. Also regularly revisiting the syllabus and seeking student input for that process. For example, you could provide students with the syllabus and ask them how they would revise it based on their needs and interpretations, and then present an updated syllabus that reflects the combined changes and discuss that with the class. As my colleagues mentioned, it's good to include texts from writers of different genders, races, dialects, countries, and regions of the US throughout the year, and not during one window of time, not during an international week, for example, because that would just reinforce the idea that diversity is something to relegate to a specific moment rather than integrate throughout the term. So now onto the curriculum, what we expect students to do in the classroom. Here are some guiding ideas. Nurture critical inquiry and reflection, study anti-racist and colonial realities, acknowledge that education is not necessarily neutral. Teachers have the authority to either reinforce or combat any narratives that can create power dynamics, and challenge dominant and exclusive expectations. For example, standardized testing can reinforce the idea that there is one right way to be a student, one metric for intelligence. So doing away with that whenever possible opens up different ways for students to feel and be treated as successful. So now we'll look at a handout with activities that can lead to anti-racist and decolonial outcomes. One could be have students list words or phrases that are common in their communities or households, and then pair students to review each other's lists and talk about the differences in what's considered appropriate language in their networks. And the point is to realize that there are going to be natural differences, but those differences don't point to any inferiorities or superiorities. They're just there. And this gets at linguistic diversity. You can also use students' original writing in classroom discussions and selecting writing that varies in things like English proficiency, style, but are all equally effective. They all deserve an audience. And at the end, you can even publish a collection or an anthology of these texts and host a reading event for students and their friends and families. This can show that standard American English is not the only way to write well. Another example, so after providing students with several model texts, ask them to focus on one of the authors as a model writer that they will study for the rest of the semester. And the model text should represent prolific and celebrated writers from backgrounds similar to those of the students so that they can find them relatable and inspiring. Students can write about why they chose that writer and propose something inspired by that writer. This activity can give students some agency and decision making. Lastly, ask students to bring in excerpts from their favorite texts, and this can be across many genres, and have them teach the class mini lessons on it. This can empower students to learn from and teach each other. And these are just 4 examples. Please feel free to check out the full list here. We shared the link in the chat. And here is a link to our resource folder, again, shared in the chat as well. It includes the handouts I've reviewed, as well as a list of readings, websites, and other resources. We hope you'll find them useful. Thank you.
So we're going to move now into a moment of free writing, and then we'll have a chance to talk a little in breakout rooms and come together for a Q&A, sharing some of our ideas and our questions. And so please get a piece of paper or just pull up a place to word process on your computer. And we're just going to invite you to choose 1 or 2 things that you might want to change or rework in your teaching to follow a more anti-racist and decolonial approach. And then to also start thinking about how would you go about changing that? What's the work involved to make that change? And while you're writing, I will put a link to that. There's various handouts in the folder that we've shared, but the link that Erkanaz was just going over, the purple handout, will be like a kind of a quick cheat sheet that you can look at to inspire some of your brainstorms. So I'll put that in the chat now, and in the meantime, let's put just 5 minutes on the clock for folks to take a
Missy, you froze up there for a second. Will you just repeat the last 30 seconds or so of what you said?
Oh, yeah, thank you for letting me know. So I'm gonna put the little abbreviated checklist that Erkanaz was sharing in her presentation in the chat right now that you guys can all reference. But right now we're just asking everybody to spend about 5 minutes just brainstorming what they might do differently in their classrooms and how they might get that work done. So I hope you had as rich of a discussion as we did in our group. And I really just want to open it up. If folks, folks that are here as participants, if you could share with us some of the ideas or questions or comments or stories that you shared in your group, we would be happy to hear it. And so I'll leave it to you. Oh, if Vienna,
you're muted.
My name is Vienna Carroll, and my approach to pedagogy and art, which I use to teach, is to center what you often call the other in the story. In my case, I'm centering Black people in the story, and I'm telling hero stories about Black people, and again, specifically in the pre-Civil War time, to show how we freed ourselves from slavery and that we had agency. I think that that's really, really, really important, because often the othering includes some an unfortunate element of lack of agency. So I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you, Vienna. So important that changing the narrative when the dominant narrative continues to be white, male, middle and upper class. I love that. And art gives us such an important space to explore that and demonstrate that. Yeah, Vienna, take down the name. Apparently there's a lot of good work coming out, but Vienna Carroll, Google, Google her. Yeah, Esther, please.
Oh, yeah. So in my group, I shared about how I do my science and math teaching. For math, if I'm teaching a topic like in simple interest, I want to use real names of my students so they can feel at home, ask their questions. If I have a student like Kate, I can say, if Kate has 5,000 in her savings account, so the student can say, if I have 10,000. And so the class keeps going on. When I taught also reading, we like to read out in the basic class, students from various parts of the world. So when a student is reading, we understand what he's saying. If anybody is laughing, and then I'll just say we are in New York, and then we have different accents. So there is no one best accent, especially if I can understand all my students. So my students understand these things, and then we have a great learning environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. I love that example, like even just focusing on how we talk to our students, how we refer to them, how they refer to each other, how they interact, so that our students are knowing our values for acknowledging and valuing the full identity of everyone present. That's such a big deal. And it happens sometimes in small ways of like getting to know each other and making sure we know each other's names and when we're using our authentic names and that everyone's pronouncing it and we practice that work together can make it such a huge difference. Other comments from your groups?
I'll make a comment. That is that if we were in Florida, we wouldn't be able to be having this discussion. And it's so important to realize that this topic is banned almost, not just in Florida, but in other states. And it's a topic that we could be discussing with our students at all levels, adult education, college graduate. There's a law being passed right now in Florida that would require professors to have their syllabi reviewed They have to submit it 2 months ahead of the class. It has to be reviewed. It can be rejected if it has some of the elements that we're discussing today. And tenured professors can be fired. So this is an explosive issue politically in education today. We could talk about that more.
Thank you for sharing that, Barbara. I mean, you and I were talking recently about one of our former graduate students who was told that they can't put topics of race in their syllabus at a university.
In Florida.
Florida.
A graduate of our MA in Language and Literacy program, who's a PhD student there. Yes, Valerie Smith.
Makes this conversation all the more important, but it's, gosh, to imagine having all those syllabi checked, that's outrageous.
By who? Who's going to check them? And for what? It's very scary.
I feel the same way. Well, like, have you ever heard about like who dominates, like what, and who decides what textbooks are going to be used in like K through 12? Like, it's like a very small committee of older white men for the most part in Texas that decides for the country what the standard books are going to be. It's just,
there's a long list of banned books.
Yeah, so I welcome conversation about these topics, and also would be happy to hear specific things or general things that you do in your classrooms or questions that you have. Yeah, please, Joan.
Well, one thing we talked a little about, I raised the fact that I teach English as a second language for adults, which means obviously have a lot of class discussion and sharing and so on. But one thing that I want to get is student input. You know, you talked about sharing syllabus. It's a little bit different in my classroom, but you know, what do they want? More of something, less of something, a different way of addressing? And my problem is how to do that without falling into a lot of teacher talk that doesn't really help the students understand what it is that, you know, how to express their interests. So we had a little discussion around that. And one thing that I realize is I need to do it more often, you know, on a more continuous basis, and have students kind of think about what it is they're learning, why, rather than just, do you want more of this or that, but rather get into how is this working for you and what are your goals, that kind of thing. So
it makes so much sense.
Something I'm going to try to work on.
It reminds me of the first time I was like, I'm going to just do a Freirean critical pedagogy approach. And I just walked in the classroom and I was like, what do we want to do? And everyone's like, are you kidding me? Just tell me, like you're the professor, you know? And it took a lot of work to get to a space. And I realized that I just went in there too free for all. And I think you're right, Joan, like sometimes we have to introduce it in a way and build that comfort and that confidence and that practice. And then we can start opening up more and more. So it is a challenge. It's not as easy as just deciding, we're just going to bring in student input. You know, that's a new practice that a lot of students aren't often invited to do. And they're going to be skeptical, and they may not feel comfortable or may not have the ideas just yet, and may need time and space and support. That's great. Let's see. I'm going to do some cold calling. How about Sassy or Arosio? Do either of you want to share?
Sure. So I'm actually a math teacher. So I think it can be a little bit hard to incorporate certain aspects of this into math, but I think it's super important because math sometimes is like kind of considered elitist or like not for me because, you know, I'm not good enough for math or I can't do it. And so I was sharing that's one of the activities that I do is a math autobiography, which is a little bit more successful, or I've had more success doing it with younger students than with adult learners because they don't really write much. And so some of the feedback I got, which I think is really helpful, is to try and do it twice, just because they may not be comfortable yet in the beginning, or to try and do it like almost as a group discussion, and less as an autobiography and more of as a like, what have we experienced in the math classroom that has been harming to us? And I like to do that just to get, to kind of say, okay, so this is what has happened to you in the math classroom, and this is not going to happen in this math classroom. So.
Oh, I think that's a great way to implement this stuff in a math class. Like, I was going to talk about like just even acknowledging the racial makeup and the diversity, linguistic and otherwise, and cultural in the classroom, our different learning backgrounds and experiences, who tends to go into math majors, who doesn't, and why, how that's racialized. So that's great. I love that idea of an autobiography. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and on that note, like I think along with kind of discussing, the racial makeup today of like math and everything, I think it's also important to acknowledge that, I'm not very familiar with math, but what my understanding is that there are like origins of mathematical formulas, or origins of math from non-Western, non-white, non-Eurocentric sources. And I think it's really important to tell our students that that they came from maybe ancient theories, or ancient mathematicians, the Egyptians, that sort of thing, and to really talk about the history of math, because I think these days it just tends to be kind of like a flat thing, like, okay, this is math, it's 1 + 1, it's a squared plus b squared equals c squared, but like, where did it actually come from, and like who contributed to this field of knowledge that is not regularly addressed? I mean, maybe that could be like a nice source to get your students thinking just about like, where does knowledge come from, and why maybe do we uplift certain parts of math and not others, or maybe this culture is really known for math but not for other things. So just to get them thinking about alternative modes of knowledge and that sort of thing. So thank you, Rocio.
I think we have time for one more comment, because I believe the last 5 minutes are saved for evaluations. So yeah, there will be a new link, I think, pasted again for the evaluations. But any other final comments from folks?
Yeah, two things that was very helpful to me in our breakout room was how to get input from students. And so we're reflecting on the fact that some students may not be comfortable with talking. And so doing anonymous Google surveys, right, throughout the term of the course. What more do you need from me? What is working? What isn't working? What about this reading? Would you keep that for the next term? I thought that was a wonderful suggestion. The other thing was to think of the syllabus as not something fixed, right? But something that is very flexible. That is, if the teacher, if the instructor as well is flexible, then the syllabus could be something that is forever changing, forever growing, right? As opposed to you come in and you stick by this, but asking the students, hey, do you need more time with this assignment, right? And then holding a vote in the classroom, and that vote, and that in itself, for many of us teaching integrated English literacy and civics education, so teaching them civics, hey, let's take a vote.
Filling that out, I'll just say thank you everyone for coming. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much.
It was an excellent session. Really.
Yes, it was.
Great.
Thank you for the resources. That was a really great contribution.
Thank you.